participants that I believe illustrates really well the power of connecting people to nature through birds. So before I get into what that work actually is, I'd like to acknowledge my positionality because ultimately research is a social practice that's influenced by our experiences, locations, and identity. So I think it's really important that I acknowledge why I'm doing this work before we get into what that work actually is. So like I mentioned, I studied biology for my undergraduate degree, pursuing mainly courses in conservation and ecology. And then in my final year, I read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and then later The Serviceberry, which are two books that really transformed my perspective on the nature of the ecological crises, and that conservation is just as much about people as it is about the plants and the animals. So I think it's also really important that I acknowledge that none of the ideas I'll be discussing today are all that new. Indigenous peoples have always known the importance to land, and I hope that my work can complement the work being done by nations across this land. I'll also just quickly say that my relationship with birds is relatively recent in the last 5 years, when I was taken under the wing of my undergraduate mentor, Dr. Mennel, who handed me my first pair of binoculars and field guide and encouraged me to go watch some birds. And since then, I've developed quite the love for birds. If you know me, I talk about them very often. And would definitely call myself a casual bird watcher. And I've been lucky enough to do some field work on the remote island where there was lots of birds, and that was a really transformative experience for me. So zooming out, in 2015, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, ITBEST, published its global assessment in which it concluded that if we're to achieve a just and sustainable future, we need transformative change in our systems, but also acknowledging that systems are built by individuals, and so they too need transformation. And research and indigenous philosophies suggest that the combined effects of modernism, colonialism, and capitalism really connection to the land and drive a notion of a good life that's associated with material consumption, displays of wealth. And most people in IRES are probably familiar with Donella Meadows' work, Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in the System, where she describes places to intervene in a system. And one of the most powerful is to change the mindset or the paradigm of that system. So in other words, if we're able to transform the notion of a good life into one that's associated with positive relations with non-human others and other humans, we might begin to decouple consumption and well-being. And at the root of the crises we face in this current Western notion of good life is a fundamental disconnection of humans from nature. If one does not feel as though they are part of nature, it's almost impossible for them to feel and understand the proportionate impact that humans have on our planet and to understand how critical nature is to our survival. With relationship to nature, what compels a person to protect it? And so disconnect is particularly pronounced among urban residents, where the ability to seek out and connect with nature is increasingly rare. This is a phenomenon known as the extinction of experience, and people's awareness of environmental issues is influenced crucially by their experiences of nature and everyday surroundings. A key concept here is relational values. So these are guiding principles and values that emerge from our relationships with nature, and they're crucial for cultivating environmental care, a different notion of a good life. And many studies have shown that a connection to nature as a form of relational values is strongly correlated with pro-environmental behaviors. So this kind of raises an important question about what kinds of experiences and interventions actually help to reconnect people to nature in meaningful, lasting ways. So existing interventions tend to cluster into three categories: to have awareness raising with things like documentaries, completing a task, so community science, species surveys, beach cleanups, that sort of thing, and then community building and socially embedded practices like community gardens and repair cafes. And so each of these target really important mechanisms of change, including knowledge and attitudes, social norms, identities, relationships, and behavior directly. But just important to note that especially awareness raising alone is rarely sufficient to sustain environmental stewardship in the long term. So more active and immersive forms of engagement tend to have stronger and more lasting effects, and a growing body of research shows that identity, so how they see themselves in relation to nature, is strongest predictors of pro-environmental behavior. So with all this in mind, I designed a community-based nest program called Nestigators, where I attempted to combine awareness, action, and community and identity. And my affinity for birds and my previous experiences with them, to do something with them for my master's. And they're also they're one of the most diverse and charismatic species that you can find, or group of animals, sorry, that are accessible in urban areas, especially when, you know, the notion of urban wildlife tends to be like rats and raccoons. They also connect multiple ecosystems and threats given their behaviors and migratory patterns and all that sort of thing. And then there's also a really long history of relationships and interactions. So design nest creators building on two programs, the American version by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Nestwatch, and then the Canadian version from Birds Canada, Project Nestwatch, ultimately using their monitoring protocols and a lot of their training materials, and then building in awareness, community, and identity at the local scale. And what makes nest monitoring unique is that participants repeatedly visit the same nest following a specific family period of time. Whereas with bird watching, it can be different species, different individuals, different locations, and not really a set schedule. So nest monitoring becomes less about observing nature in general and forming relationships with particular individuals, investing in the trials and tribulations of raising a family. So you can almost think of it like your own personal documentary where happening in your own neighborhood in real time with your own eyes and for you. And so that's what we think this repeated and personal interaction is what we hypothesize to lead to a deeper connection. And so broadly for my research questions, I asked, do prolonged and structured experiences observing, learning about urban birds foster different or stronger relationships to nature in urban adults? And today I'll be discussing two sub-questions. So the first, does participation in sustained nature immersion program increase nature relatedness? And the second, does participation in a sustained nature immersion program nurture relational value? So for the sake of time, I can't get too the program design and the massive amount of work that went into this. So this is kind of a short story snapshot of what I've been working on and how Nestigating proceeded. So I recruited participants from Metro Vancouver in March of last year, and then I trained them in April and sent them off to find and monitor a nest in their neighborhood between May and August. They were all added to a community Padlet board, which is like an online forum where I would share updates and ask participants to share pictures of what they were monitoring. And then I also put together these monthly action items. So these were documents breaking down specific threats to urban birds and different ways the participants did. So this included bird building collisions, domestic cat predation, habitat loss, and then food waste and nest predators. I also hosted monthly guest lectures with scientists, birds, or the sustainability sphere for participants, extra learning. I administered 3 questionnaires, so a pre-participation questionnaire in May, a midway check-in in June, and a final post-participation questionnaire in August. And the first questionnaire was the longest, and some grounding questions about previous experiences with birds and community science, demographics. And then for all 3 questionnaires, I repeated questions about awareness of, affect for, and attitudes towards birds, as well as the nature-related scale and relational values scale. I also performed a semi-structured interview at the end of the program that went more into depth about the participants' program experience and their relationships with nature and birds. And yeah, I'll just note that down here you can see kind of timeline of participant drop-off over the course of this long, intense program, and we ended up with 26 participants at the end. So each participant also received a care package as a way to thank them for the time. And these were either associated with identity and social signaling. So a custom t-shirt, sticker, and tote bag so that participants could be proud that they're a nestigator. And then also items that were associated with these action items included window dots, cat collar covers, native seeds, and bin lock. And these were all hand delivered by me. So out of my 26 participants, 12 were able to find a nest while 4 just illustrating that finding the nest is hard, but as we'll discuss in a little bit, very rewarding. And these nests were from a variety of species, including American crow, song sparrow, robin, barn swallow, bald eagle, black-capped chickadee, and merlin. You can also see here depicted in these images is the variety of bird species that my participants observed. Just underscore the point I made earlier that there's quite a diversity of birds in and living in urban areas. I'd love to tell you about each of these species, but I only have so much time. So to address my first question about nature relatedness, for those who aren't familiar, this is a construct and scale used to measure effective, and experiential aspects of an individual's connection to nature. And they were developed by Elizabeth Nesbet and co-authors in 2009. It's a 21-item scale that you can see depicted here that's broken down into 3 dimensions. So for example, in perspective, we have questions like, nothing I do will change problems in other places on the planet. For self, you have questions like, I always think about how my actions affect the environment. And then for experience, you have questions like, I take notice of wildlife wherever I am. And statements in blue were reverse coded, and that was a 7-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree to measure the participants' responses. So what we're looking at here in the very first column, the nature relatedness, that's the mean score across all 21 of those items. And then for perspective, it's just the questions in that dimension, self that dimension, experience that dimension. And then in the top row, we have the mean and standard deviation of the pre-test scores across all my participants, and then the mean and standard of the post-test scores. And just right off the bat, I want to note that participants came into this program already scoring quite highly. Remember, the 7 is maximum. So my participants were quite connected to nature right off. And this is partly because of how I went about sampling my eyeball. That's inconvenient. Ooh. Yeah, so this is partly because of how we went about sampling and self-selection, the demands of this kind of program. We were asking about an hour a week for about 4 months from these participants. So difficult to convince somebody who has zero interest in nature to take part in something like this. But despite that, you can see that when we use a statistical test to test the difference between 2 time points, we can see that for nature relatedness, it did come significant in a difference from pre to post, as well as for the NR self scale, which was a little more strongly significant, and again, an increase from pre to post. So despite the self-selection and the ceiling effect that quantitative has, so if like somebody responded a 6 7 on that first questionnaire and felt more strongly so on that final questionnaire, they weren't really able to respond higher than a 7, even if they might have that way. So despite these different factors and sample size, we still saw a significant increase between pre and post-test scores, which is really exciting, and not something we were expecting to see, that participants increase their nature relatedness. And from the interviews, we saw repeatedly that participants in this program increased awareness and attunements to nature, and specifically birds, to increase curiosity and appreciation of those birds, which often led to feelings of attachment, sense of place, being part of nature, and wanting to care for it. So for example, it's one quote by a participant, I would really rethink this experience with the birds in the future. I want to have the ability to really look at the environment I'm in. Especially in the nest searching process, it makes me wonder, how would it become a place that birds would like to nest in my community? So this quote just underscores that how with a program like this, it really forces you to slow down and take in your surroundings repeatedly over the course of a few months, allowing you to better learn about your non-human neighbors, which can then open to curiosity and questions such as, how do I make this better, and wanting to have more of that wildlife in your neighborhood. So then for my next question about relational values, I used a set of statements developed by IRES alumni Sarah Klein and Paige Olmsted alongside Kai and Terry in 2017. And these were originally a set of questions used to operationalize the construct of relational values. But as you can see here, I only used 5 that I felt most pertinent to my project. And these were all in their own dimensions of community, health, responsibility, kinship, and then other. And again, it's a 7 Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Okay, so what we're looking at here in that first column is the relational values, the mean score across those 5 statements. But differently for this table is we have the mean and standard deviation of the difference from the pre to post test score for the group of individuals that found a nest, and then the mean and standard deviation of the difference from pre to post for the group that did not find a nest. So this was the post score minus the pre-test score averaged across participants. And then we use a statistical test to test if there were differences between 2 groups. And we can see here for relational values, we did have a significant difference where the group that found a nest slightly increased in their relational values scores. So again, just like with nature relatedness, let's keep in mind that participants already came in quite high on this score. On this scale, most participants were scoring a 6 or a 7 right off of the bat. So again, we have the ceiling effect that even if a participant felt more strongly at the post-test questionnaire, weren't really able to respond higher than a 7. It's also important to note that because of the way this program was designed, it's hard to disentangle finding a nest from effort put into participation. So the difference here could be because of finding a nest, or it could be because those that found a nest put a little more effort into the program and engaged more with training materials and the action items and all that sort of thing. Okay, so from the interviews, themes of kinship came up quite often. For example, this one quote by a participant. So I think that kind of relationship, what I encountered after they all left the nest and they all kind of gathered around me and stuff like that, I kind of felt like an uncle, like, hey, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. They were all chirping and jostling around each other. And they're like, oh, hi, uncle. Yeah, I kind of felt like I was part of the family. And so there's just, it's well, that deep sense of connection that participants were feeling with the monitoring. Relational values that came up included attachment. So a lot of people spoke affectionately. One participant, little guys. We have health, where people were noticing, like, why are there so many more birds for participants? Why can't I find a nest? And making them question about the environment that's around them and how would they make it more healthy and bring more birds in. Ideas of identity came up, especially like reinforcement of identity, where people expressed that they were like glad to participate, reminded them about what they cared about and how they could take action. And then you also had relational values like responsibility and care come up, such as this participant. So now I definitely have that sense of more responsibility after, being part of this program, because now I'm noticing more. I'm like, oh yeah, how is my own decisions impacting this whole thing? So yeah, I definitely would recommend the program because of that, to make that connection. So again, just underscoring that once you're exposed to this whole other world that's been right under your nose, you get to understand that you're part of that same web of life, and that decisions, no matter how small or big, have these rippling effects, and wanting to make choices in order to minimize the negative effects and maximize those positive effects. Okay, so to wrap all this up, though participants already started off as quite connected to nature, we did see an increase in awareness and attachment to nature and birds specifically, an emotional investment in the birds that folks were monitoring, and an activation of identity and values. We see an increase in nature relatedness across all participants, and an increase in relational value scores for those that that my work so far is suggesting that structured bird observation and learning programs have a really powerful potential to reshape people's relationship with nature. And there's a lot of benefits to the type of program that can sustain engagement in the long term. And I personally believe that more people should be going out and watching some birds. So my next steps here are to go ahead with, second, third, and probably fourth round of those interviews. Pick this all up, and I'm hoping to defend by August. Yeah, and of course, so many people that I would like to thank for their help with this project. Of course, my supervisor, Dr. Chan, committee members, Harold, Terry, and Jode Roberts, as well as Chan's lab members, specifically Dana Johnson, who's been really helpful with the social science and qualitative side of things, an undergraduate volunteer who helped me scribe my interviews, my Badger buddy, so kind of my accountability buddy, Chloe Chang, and the beautiful logo designer. And then my good friend from back home who helped me come up with the name Nestigators, and of course my friends here at IRES that have been really incredible emotional support throughout the whole thing. So thank you so much for listening. Let's open it up to questions. Sorry.
Fantastic work. This is so impressive.
Thank
Well
you.
done. I'm really curious, how did you go about recruiting participants? You say a lot of them were already quite nature oriented.
Yeah.
How did you find them? 98 or something?
Yeah, it was quite overwhelming at first. I was like, oh my God, am I going to have to do 100 interviews? Um, so yeah, so originally I made these posters. I have to say that myself. I posted to different on Facebook, so like Vancouver Birding. I also utilized some connections with like Nature Vancouver and Pacific Spirit Park Society and different groups like that to share through their mailing list. There's also a plan to go to farmers markets to like hand out posters and recruit people there who, might not be as connected to nature, but be more interested in this sort of thing. But I hit like 98 after maybe like a week of recruiting. It's enough. So yeah, I think it would be definitely be interesting to see how this sort of program would work, have like zero interest in nature. Because like I was saying, people in had quite the interest in nature. If just
You talked about your local mention like they're kind of about doing things, but
a lot of participants like did discuss with friends or family that like, hey, I'm a nest educator. This is what I'm doing, which was really neat. Some people describe like partner like really got doing it together. There was another friend thought it was really cool, but had like missed the sign up date. So she was kind of doing the same thing, just not officially. So yeah, I think like birding is quite contagious. And once you start talking about it and like you somebody that's really passionate about it, it can be really easy to feed off and want to participate as well. So yeah.
I was wondering if you have any ideas around why under the nature related why self like that self section came out as kind of significant increase in that specific no specific question. If you have any ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have like some fully formed ideas, but some like if you look at the questions in the self, it's very much about like your own lived experience. It's really easier to change of like, oh no, like think a bit differently post this, but maybe with perspective, don't think that like they're like, well, I know that I can control my local neighborhood and what's going on there, but I don't really have much power in these really large systems. And that's not really going to change by just like going to observe some birds, if that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So there's actually a picture there that's a eagle that one of my participants monitored. So that participant was involved with Spirit Park Society have eagle monitoring program. And so that participant has been involved for a few years now, where they and eagles nest tend like they tend to lose their nest after a year. So once you find it's like a good chance if you go the following an eagle is but yeah, for like the instructions I gave to my partner was gave them a whole lot of tips about how to go out, like to find nests, what to look for. So like clumps of grass, watch for birds gathering some sticks and little twigs and whatnot, follow where they go, listen for like alarm calls, especially with crows, they'd get defensive over their nests. Um, and then once they were able, oh, I also encourage people to like use their neighbors to help. So, I mean, going back to a bit of Josephine's question is people like had a neighbor that knew that they were doing the program was like, oh my gosh, I have a robin nesting outside my window. Do you want to come and check it out? So people, yeah, I encourage people to utilize their community to help them out. And then once they found that nest, they were to revisit that nest every 3 days over the course of that nesting period. So depending on the bird, usually a month. Something like a bald eagle is like several months long. Um, and yeah, so depending on the height of the nest, like I also train participants on how to minimize disturbance to the nest. So only going so close to the nest for like a minute max just to grab that picture real quick and then step away and observe from at least 10 to 15 meters away. Make sure that the parents return to the nest so you haven't caused them to abandon it. Um, yeah, some people like you can see in this picture here, this was a barn swallow nest that was really high up and one of my like 50-meter like selfie stick, bring it up, picture in. So that was really cool. And then this participant here brought a ladder with them every time they went to go see this palm tree. So you can see how like the participants that found a nest tended to be like much more engaged wanting to do it. Yeah.
And this is great. And the,
Yeah.
um, wondering for the people that don't have access to this, a type of environment that might prefer to, like all these, programs like Cornell Lab of Pathology has in there now. They do, cool experiences. I don't imagine it would have the same effect, but do you think that any sort of appreciation could come from a structured program built around one of those virtual experiences analogous to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something I thought about a bit. We were toying with the question at the start of the design of like whether to provide participants with like a camera that could So it would minimize distress, concerns about safety and all that sort of. Yeah, I think there's something about like this quite corporeal over there. It's like again to other friends who are like, well, my area because these territory, these are my birds, right? And so I think it's really awesome to be able to like be able to go revisit, and it does increase accessibility for sure. But I think there's also something special of like, oh my gosh, I found this nest myself. Like I did this work, and it's real rewarding feeling of like a treasure hunt, a treasure, Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Part of this being a really packed day, I'm maybe going to hand it over right now to Dr. Sykes, who will be introducing our next speaker. Emily, you know her, love her.
Yeah, we do.
Big girl, and you take away over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Bonjour, my name is Dr. Leo coming out of the University of Management Professor here at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Ability. It is in this role that it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Annalise Morgan. So instead of her supervisor, who happens to be on the other side of the Atlantic at the time being. But I'm just over in Victoria, so I'm a little bit closer. So now, more about Annalise. Annalise's journey to us at IRES is a fascinating map of how art, activism, and environment intersect. She began her academic career at UNDRIP, doing an honors degree in liberal arts, specializing in literature and art history. It was there that she first became captivated by the power of contemporary art to voice stories that mainstream culture often overlooks. Specifically through the work of Indigenous artists like Ken Mompton and Rebecca Delmore, served in some scholarship. While at McGill, Annalise wasn't just studying here, she was practicing solidarity. She ran alongside her sister a nonprofit venture equity organization in Montreal, providing essential products to shelters across the city, an experience that she credits with teaching her the true value of community-led work. However, a pivotal shift occurred in the summer of 2021. While working as a cherry picker in the Okanagan, Annalise experienced a devastating forest fire season firsthand. That experience moved climate change from an abstract concept to a visceral, emotional reality. She realized that to truly engage in climate work, she first needed to understand the complex emotions that come with it. That realization took her across the Atlantic to the University of Cambridge, where she completed a Master of Education in Arts, Creativity, and Education. There, she pioneered work on how arts-based research can help us express and process climate emotions. Now, as a master's student here at IRES, Annalise has found a new intellectual home. Her current work explores how emotions shape our collective action when navigating societal crises. Since moving here to the West Coast in Vancouver, she has also deepened her exploration of identity as a settler, a journey that informs both her research and the climate emotion workshop she includes at facilitated from the city. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Annalise.
Thank you. Hello, today I'll be presenting on understanding emotions as pathway to settler accountability through an arts-based approach, which I will tell you more about very shortly. So you can understand the flow of this presentation as a bit of a journey through my process as a researcher. In 3 instances, I will kind of slow things down. You can see the snails on this slide. So slowing things down, my positionality, my methodology, and my findings. Using the snail here as a symbol of kind of who I am as a learner and as a researcher, moving forward slowly, informed by many cycles of learning. So I'm going to start us off by explaining this positionality collage, which I also brought in person, which you can check out later if you're curious. You don't have to figure out what every image is. I'll walk you through it. So the first part here refers to the fact that I'm a settler of French and Scottish descent. I grew up in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, in a very bilingual household. Those 3 cute kids are not me, but they represent my 2 sisters who really informed who I have become. Like most young Canadians, unfortunately, My education about indigeneity and Indigenous cultures was very simplistic and limited. And so throughout high school, I kind of had a very glossed over understanding of the resistance and the violence that is still ongoing on this land. And so when I went to McGill for my undergrad, I first encountered Indigenous scholarship and art, and that kind of opened my mind and eyes to a whole world of really interesting knowledge. It's also during that time that during one of my summers, I would work every summer as a camp counselor. And one summer I worked in Ivuivik, which is a small Inuit village in Nunavik in the north of Quebec. And that was my first encounter with what I now understand to be settler emotions, kind of these emotions that non-Indigenous people feel when entering in relation with Indigenous communities. And so these feelings of discomfort or curiosity or open-mindedness or worry that I will cause further harm because of the patterns I kind of have inherited. And so this led me to dive deeper into my identity as a settler when moving to Vancouver and doing this work. And it led me to ask a question, how can I, as a non-Indigenous person, unsettle myself to name, not just in words, but also through my actions, and confront the ongoing legacies of colonization today? And so when I started reading about decolonization and reconciliation, I realized that a lot of the scholarship puts the burden of healing on the shoulders of Indigenous people. But as the residential school survivor, Reverend Stan McKay, explains, the perpetrators are wounded and marked by history in ways that are different from the victims, but both groups require healing. It's not the same healing, it doesn't involve the same things, but if we want to build new relationships that are built on respect, we have our own responsibility as non-Indigenous people to kind of show up. And so this research focuses on the emotional work that is required from non-Indigenous Canadians to build relationships with Indigenous peoples that are based on responsibility and respect. It counterbalances the Western tendency to over-research Indigenous peoples by turning the gaze inward and probing at settler identity. It's quite personal too, because I'm also a settler. And so I'm kind of navigating through this. And so to inform this project, I'm using a framework of desire-based research. Desire-based research recognizes the difficult history of a given problem, but also seeks to find the hope and the complexity and the visions of what we are striving towards. And so informed by this framework, my two research questions are, what are the emotions that non-Indigenous City of Vancouver employees feel about reconciliation and decolonization? And second, how can educators harness these emotions to promote learning and accountability? You might be wondering, why the City of Vancouver? Why city employees? Well, as someone coming from Montreal, Vancouver is doing pretty interesting work in this area. And so Vancouver called itself City of Reconciliation in 2014, and is still figuring out what that means, of course. And they published in 2022 their UNDRIP strategy, and in 2024 their UNDRIP action plan, which maps out in a very concrete way kind of all of the steps that can be done to align the city work with the needs of the local nations. Now, as a city employee doing this work, oftentimes they're non-Indigenous, and so in these encounters, they might feel a lot of complex emotions and have a lot of work to do to navigate this with respect and presence. So this is why I'm doing this work here. In terms of my methodology, I'll explain a little bit about the collage part in a minute, but I've done a workshop followed by a focus group with a group of 7 non-Indigenous City of Vancouver employees who are working on decolonial or reconciliatory work. I was assisted by Dana as a note taker, thank you. And these workshops and focus groups were informed by 3 semi-structured interviews that I did with an art therapist, an Indigenous city planner, and a scholar of settler emotions. Now, this is one way of understanding like the structure of my project. But since I'm doing collage, this is another way of understanding this same project. And so this is a collage version of how my methodological approach. Before I dive deeper into what these images mean, maybe it's worth explaining what collage can do as a decolonial arts-based method. And so collage is a really interesting method because it moves away from the binary thoughts and the binary thought patterns and language that are often characteristic of Western research. And it means that on one page, multiple meanings can coexist and multiple ways of knowing can coexist as well. The fact of like really making and tearing and gluing paper to another page is an integration of head, heart, and hands because it's a very active process, which can be helpful because it can help people explain things that are very to put into words. If you think about my workshop, the first 45 minutes of it, people were silent, making their own collage. And so think about the depth and complexity of what people express once they start speaking for the first time. And finally, it echoed my desire-based framework because I was surprised at how much joy and laughter was involved in the workshop, even though we were talking about pretty serious things. And so going back to my methodology collage, this section here kind of speaks to the legacy of extraction of both resources and erasure of Indigenous knowledge that my project kind of builds itself against, but also is kind of inherits as a researcher and navigating that complexity. This part here talks about the messiness of settler emotions and how many and how entangled they can be, but also this cyclical approach that I'm taking with learning and trying to kind of come to the same knowledge with a new set of eyes at every step of my research process. And then finally, this part speaks to kind of the desire-based vision that I have for the future and what could happen if this project kind of had a real impact on the real world. The image on the corner, the image on the bottom right is a photo of the Squamish Youth Powwow, which I attended. It was my first powwow that I had ever attended last summer. And it shows both like my hope for Indigenous cultural resurgence, but also how this project is changing me as a researcher as I go through it. Now, beyond collage being a method and a research method, as I've grown more familiar with my process, I've also started to think about collage as potentially being a methodology. And so many of you are familiar that a research project is this process of bringing together disparate knowledge from literature and like interviews and my personal experiences. And so that in itself is a bit of a collage. But beyond that, the fact, for example, the images that are stuck together on a page can be close together, but will never kind of completely merge and they remain separate. It means that we can have different knowledges coexist without kind of blending them or losing any of their individual strengths, which echoes a little bit of what Tuck and Yang speak when they're explaining the ethics of incommensurability. Also, collage is really interesting because it's a means to reconfigure what I know. And so I'm kind of seeing these images and I have inherited so many kind of beliefs and values, and collage, instead of kind of being like, I don't want to think about all of the problematic heritage that I have, invites me to kind of reconfigure it, tear it apart, stick it back together in a way that is more aligned with the world I'm hoping to build. Also, what's cool is every time I see my collage, I see something different, I make new links. And since it's based in intuition, then it means that the meaning is flexible even though the images stay put. And so the workshop that I ran was with these 7 employees who were like somehow super excited to do arts-based stuff. They were like, best way to spend my Friday afternoon. And so they were great. And they answered on a single page 3 prompts that I gave one at a time. And they all had their pouch of images and stuck them on the page. And so the results that I'm going to speak to are kind of based on that workshop. I'm still, of course, in my data analysis process, as you understand. So, you know, this is where we're at. So these were my findings, which as an arts-based nerd was very exciting to interact with. The joy of having like paper medium to look into instead of hours of recordings only. I'd also have hours of recording, but it is complemented by this visual data. And so my research questions, the one I'm going to answer most is, what are the emotions that non-Indigenous City of Vancouver employees feel with regards to reconciliation and decolonization? So you can see some people had like very clear answers, and other people were like, I think in spirals, so my thing is kind of a spiral. And all of the participants got to take their collages home because it was important to me that participants took home the thing they had made. So I did my analysis on photos. And so these collages were a lot of visual and auditory data. And so how could I bring all of this together? And so through careful kind of coding and analysis of the collages, I created what is called response art. And I feel comfortable sharing it with you. So this is my finding collage as a response art to what was shared with me by participants. I feel comfortable sharing it with you because I shared it back during the focus group, and many people expressed that, you know, this really resonated with what they had meant in the first workshop. And so I'm going to walk you through my findings using my findings collage. So this section of the collage speaks to the inherited myths about indigeneity that a lot of participants kind of received. First, about Indigenous cultures being portrayed in the past, and second of all, the scarcity perspective that is often a part of how we speak about Indigenous cultures. And so the emotions that came up a lot when people were talking about this was confusion, fear, and a sense of innocence. One key quote that illustrates this is a participant said, in elementary school, we did learn about Indigenous people, but in the past tense. We did learn about some of the darker things that happened, but it was definitely quite glossed over, which, as you can know from my positionality, really resonated with what my experience. This section speaks to how from this inherited myth making, a lot of people through their job at the City of Vancouver and through different experiences of learning became agents of change. And so learning from hands-on experiences on the land or learning from knowledge holders, Indigenous knowledge holders, people kind of started to act. A metaphor that came up that was fascinating was the metaphor of fire. Multiple people talked about that. And fire both as an opportunity to burn what is problematic, but also as an opportunity to fire up. And so you can see I cleverly put my fire both above the history and underneath the butt of a person who's getting up and doing something about it. And so the quote that I chose to illustrate this is, I think then coming out of that anger was this Japanese word, which is called ichinen. You know, deep feeling that I want to take action. How can I move towards that? So a lot of people kind of were very politicized and very proactive. Now, to complexify this, however, currently, I don't know how much you've been following municipal politics, but in Vancouver in the last few months with the new budget, it's been quite challenging. And so beyond having individual emotions about their decolonial work, there was also a layered experience because people were feeling big feelings about what was happening at the city scale and how city dynamics were kind of impeding decolonial work from happening. And so some people talked about this idea of camouflage, saying, I feel like when you're a city staff person, you still have to fit within the system you're trying to change. It feels like censorship sometimes, but sometimes you do have to wear that camouflage a bit, change the words that you're saying, but like have that good intention still to move things forward. And so here we have someone with the goggles, kind of, not goggles, binoculars, in camouflage, looking at the city dynamics and kind of hiding a little bit some of the more political work that they're doing. There was also a lot of talk about defining reconciliation and decolonization and how it was important to define these as collective projects, as groups, and finding community. So many people spoke about the hope and also the gratitude that they felt with regards to the other teammates that they were surrounded by at the city. And so one person said, "A lot has happened, long way to go. It'll be a living, breathing, ongoing process." And that is what reconciliation is. And then finally, this little person, which has been in the center of this collage this whole time, illustrates this importance of a personal learning journey. All of my participants were talking about different key moments in their learning where things had shifted and they had changed their minds. And that was really interesting, and I will look into this further. But it was really important to to understand kind of the ways in which people's paths are shifted by key moments in their lives. And so emotions that were expressed were like curiosity, but also a sense of humility. And one person said, "Everything about my work is still like a process of self-discovery." And another person said, "Walking on the same lands, but differently as a guest." And so I think that when we're talking about reconciliation and decolonization, it brings up a host of different emotions in people. And if we want to do this work long term and to not burn out, it's important to recognize them, to name them, and to understand how they impact our work and our lives and our relationships. Collage is pretty cool because it provides an opportunity for non-Indigenous people to reflect on their journey in a way that kind of brings together their head, their heart, and their hands. And that promotes reflexivity and deeper learning, hopefully. And to close, I was just wanting to kind of nod to the fact that these emotions are kind of happening around us all the time. We can see it in the news a bunch with the Cowichan Tribe decision on land title, but also the Skszwx housing development and what's happening, and some people being really excited about it, some people being like, "I don't know." And then also Orange T-shirt days happening at UBC. Like, these are things that we feel, especially in this program where we talk about Indigenous knowledge systems a bunch. How do we relate to this knowledge as non-Indigenous people? And so instead of pushing these emotions away and being uncomfortable about the guilt or the shame that comes up when we're talking about these really complex histories and ongoing legacies, my question to you today is, how can we work with these emotions toward deeper learning and better relationship building? And I want to acknowledge that this work was done with the support and the help of the Agesta Lab. Dana was my note taker, as you know, but also my supervisor and my committee members, including DeAndre, and City Studio Vancouver, who accepted to host the workshops for free. And then also the biggest thanks goes out to my participants, without who this project would not have been possible. So thank you so much. And you can come check these out later. Yes. This is an excellent question. So I did offer participants a pouch of about like 120 images each, because going through magazines would mean that we would spend the whole 2 hours like flipping through, and you get lost in an article and then you lose focus. And so it was important to me to have a somewhat supported like flipping through process. In terms of the selection of images, I ran like a pilot with my lab, and then kind of asked participants what was missing. I also ran that again with Maria Jose, who donated a bunch of her time to be like, "You need a photo about this." And it was really a question of balance, because I wanted people to have the freedom to pick whatever resonated, but also like, how can I decide, if I've never met these participants, what will resonate? And that's where collage was actually quite useful, because an image doesn't have to mean exactly literally what it shows. And so that's one thing that I made sure to underline early on in the workshop. I said, if you see a rock, it can be a rock if you want it to be, but it can also mean stability. It can mean anchoring. It can mean I don't know, millennia. You know, I don't know what rocks symbolize to people, but yes. And so collage is both, obviously there is some limiting due to the fact that I have to select some images, a little bit like in an interview script. You can't have an infinite amount of questions. You kind of have to hone in. But then there's a lot of freedom because images can become symbols and mean a bunch of different things. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and then also like, how did the participants collaborate with their background to make sure that they were trying on their collage?
I can show you more. Yeah. So I am new to collage. Collage is not my medium. You might know me as a theater kid. So I did a bunch of improv theater. That's kind of my practice. I've been teaching improv, performing. And like my previous master's, I did it arts-based as well, but using improv. More on that later if you want to ask me. But so collage was new for me. And it was important for me to also be vulnerable and test it out for myself before imposing it to participants. The reason I chose collage is that for non-artists, collage is often the easiest way in. Think about drawing and like having that blank page and then me being like, what do you think about decolonization? And being like, ah! And so collage is like a very supported form of arts-based research because people, you know, everyone can stick something on a page. Actually, participants during the workshop, I was like really careful to explain everything so they would feel like included and understand how to do things. And they like later like laughed at me because they were like, we know, like we can do this. Like it's not rocket science. So yeah, I kind of chose collage as a very beginner-friendly form of arts-based research because the goal of arts-based research is to kind of push people deeper. And if the arts-based method is a barrier to people really engaging, then it's doing the opposite of what it's meant to do. Yeah, Tarek.
I'm wondering, when you're talking, when you're doing the workshop, when you do you find that participants have well, I guess, or the knowledge, or they like express emotions, or are there specific emotions that are expressed more so than others? And or is it like do you find that there's often like a replication of like the emotions that you're describing, rather than like kind of like back to you, like, oh yeah, like I also.
Yeah. First of all, I'm careful not to say what people should feel so that kind of what comes up can come up more organically. It's a good question. Like with regards to this, the prompts of the collage, as you can see, that's like illustrate how you thought or felt about Indigenous peoples before you started this job. And so in the prompt, there were a few like emotion generating words, which kind of helped people go in that direction in collage making. And so people did bring up emotions when they were talking, like speaking to their collage. And then I think that my goal with this research is more so to recognize the diversity and the interrelatedness of these emotions than deciding which ones are like the top ones. I think that when we think like when we're talking about eco-emotion, for example, a lot of the times people only know about eco-anxiety. And a lot of my work when I was at Cambridge was to kind of deconstruct, like, I think under that anxiety, maybe we're anxious because we're not naming whatever else is happening. And so kind of speaking to that complexity, and it'll be different in each person. And then when it comes to these settler emotions or non-Indigenous emotions or emotions about indigeneity, haven't figured my term yet. I think, again, like just recognizing that it's not just guilt or it's not just shame. There's also a huge amount of hope, there's some motivation to change things, there's some gratitude. And so it's way more complex than that. And how can we kind of use all of them to understand ourselves better? Yeah. Oh, no. Dan, sorry, I had pointed at you, so you will go. Oh, it's true. Oh.
Yeah, like lately I've been thinking, chewing over some of my own work, that like organizing a workshop like this, I don't know if this resonates with you, but like I've realized it's effective community organizing, where you're oriented around a certain goal that is reconciliation, that will have, you know, selected for people that were working in reconciliation space already, have it sort of goal to work, right? And I'm wondering if you feel like through this process, you created stronger relationships. Were these people working together already before this process? And do they now feel more connected to each other through this? I mean, it's kind of broader political comment that's not as increasing with reconciliation at the city side, right? But they're still trying to do this work. So,
yeah. Great question. So first question was, did they know each other? Did they work with each other? Kinda. So there were different people from different teams, kind of a big variety. And most people knew someone in the workshop. So they arrived and they were like, hey. But at the same time, not everyone knew everyone. And so by the end of the workshop, there were like 3 different people being like, we should get coffee. So a lot of people were like kind of networking or building some connections there. And also finding solace in hearing other people speak to the really complex emotional aspects of their job. One participant, for example, is non-Indigenous, but her whole team is Indigenous. And like, she was kind of grateful to have a space where she could speak to other non-Indigenous people about the more complicated things that she'd been experiencing. And then when we got back to the focus group, in between the workshop and the focus group, a month had elapsed, and people had been fired, teams had been rearranged, a lot of shifts had been happening. And so for a lot of people, that second workshop was also kind of maybe a relief to be with people who were like-minded and who were also experiencing the loss in the same way, even though they were spread around the city. So short answer is, I mean, obviously, like, a lot of this work was not my doing. I just made the space available. But yes, I do think that people were kind of coming together because of their shared interests and values. Yeah. This is it. Thank you.
I'm not here, so I want to tell you that, you know, when you walk out there, there might be snacks, but I don't really know what you're walking out to. So please be gracious. Right? I'll give you a holler whether we go 5 minutes to come back. Peter, we're around you.
Thanks, Dana.
I see it. It was so good.
Et puis, donc, le collage que tu présentes, c'est celui que toi, tu as fait?
Ouais.
It's amazing, both of you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna do that.
You did it, both of you.
Environmental planning, and she's for the agriculture for her master's degree. She's part of a larger study involving a number of economists and number of people studying nutrient management and climate mitigation in vegetable crops. organic vegetable crop in British Columbia, and she took on the very challenging task of trying to understand the economic and practical implications of these different nutrient management strategies. So I'll let her share how she did that. Let's go.
And this one, the other one is. And paste it.
How do I flip it?
Let's go that way. And then just be mindful of your hair.
Okay, how does that sound? Sound good? You guys can hear me?
Wonderful.
Wonderful. This is my first time using a mic system like this. So thank you for your patience. Okay, thank you to Hannah for that introduction. And yes, thank you to everyone for being here. I'm really excited to finish off the symposium today and to finally get to share my completed work with everyone. So I hope you're going to enjoy this with me. Yeah, I opened with, I think this might be my favorite picture I've taken. This was just at the first Pacific Ag Conference I went to through this research, and I had never seen a tractor this big. So I got really excited and nerdy about it. And I think it captures the joy that carried me through. I made sure you could see my very silly, happy face. Yeah, this is how my research makes me feel, and that's what brought me through it. So I'm going to present to you today my research titled Cost-Benefit Analysis of Organic Nutrient Management Strategies for Climate-Resilient Agriculture in British Columbia. My research started with this fundamental understanding. Climate change is driving severe global and regional disruptions that undermine agricultural productivity and threaten the stability of essential ecosystems. Rapidly accelerating climate instability is causing more frequent and severe storm systems, warmer year-round temperatures, and increased incidences of drought around the world. These acute weather events endanger crops and livestock. They destroy productive land and essential infrastructure, and they even put farmers and farm workers in harm's way. Weather forecasting has predicted that 2026 will be the 13th consecutive year of global average temperatures more than 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Again, 13th, ouch. So in short, climate change has and will continue to severely impact the ability of farmers to produce food at a global level. Climate impacts on agriculture in Canada and BC in particular are severe. Canada is experiencing warming at twice the rate as the rest of the planet, up to 4 times the rate the further north you go. These sporadic extreme weather events, such as extreme heat, drought, extreme rain, flooding, and wildfire, are becoming more frequent and more severe as climate change progresses. I'm sure many of us have some experience, even if it's just the smoke or watching it on the news. In the short time I've lived in BC, I think I've experienced all of these in some manner. In British Columbia, these warmer year-round temperatures, increasing seasonal variability, and decreasing summer precipitation are jeopardizing agricultural water availability, crop health, and soil quality. These, in turn, are straining regional emergency management systems and undermining food security for British Columbian communities long-term. Strengthening agricultural climate resilience requires BC farmers to navigate complex decisions about innovation, adaptation, and trade-offs at the farm level. Climate resilience is absolutely crucial. In this context, climate resilience refers to the ability of a farming system to manage change by recovering from shocks, so extreme events or persistent stressors, and adjusting to new conditions while maintaining essential functions. Those essential functions being producing food and farmers making a living. Farmers have limited time, land, effort, and money that they can risk on trying new things to find solutions to these emergent climate challenges. BC farmers and the agricultural industry need actionable information about the potential economic and environmental impacts of the trade-offs that they are making and the adaptive farming practices that they are considering. Quantitative evidence is a powerful tool to communicate outcomes, convince policymakers and industry groups, and enable farmer-led innovation to strengthen climate resilience. All of these understandings and several years being a climate activist, climate change enthusiast, reading everything I could get my hands on led me here to this research question that guided my master's thesis over the last 3 years. How do choices about organic nutrient management practices affect farm-level economics for small to medium-scale vegetable farmers in British Columbia? And this is not me on that tractor, that's from the UBC farm. Just to clarify. So I'm moving on to my methodology now. I'm gonna first explain, when I talk about farm economics, I'm referring to how agricultural producers utilize the available resources to produce commodities. So these resources can include physical inputs, labor, land, knowledge, and human and ecological network. And revenues and receipts. Many management decisions involve long-term costs and slow occurring. Lag time or establishment and the eventual payoff puts farmers in a really difficult position of making assumptions about future conditions and investing current resources with only short-term data. Now, cost-benefit analysis is an approach increasingly used in Canada with real potential to bridge this gap between economic assessment tools and farmer realities. It monetizes all outcomes of an action as benefits of costs and compares alternative actions to identify the greatest possible benefit from those options. CBA can evaluate several farming practice options against each other over a variable time range and in very particular farm contexts. This better captures farming practices that are subject to these temporal lags, which often are present when farmers are pursuing climate resilience. However, there are no easy-to-use tools, no farmer guides, and not even any real regional research here in BC addressing the complex nature of agricultural climate resilience through cost-benefit analysis. And I'm going to shorten that to CBA. It's a lot to say. So I set out to build this missing piece, a cost-benefit calculator tool that could support farm-level decision-making about adopting climate-resilient agricultural practices in BC. I did this by creating a calculator framework with the following 9 categories. So the 6 cost categories in the framework are farm overhead, infrastructure and equipment, field preparation, planting for harvest, field maintenance, and end-of-season activities, following the seasonal structure of agriculture in BC, with field preparation being early spring, and then end-of-season activities falling at the end of autumn. And then my benefit categories are crop sales and open-ended non-sale benefits and external funding. In order to test and refine this calculator from 9 broad categories into a usable tool, I incorporated collected data from on-farm UBC research trials. And this is a real photo of the research trials. I did not take the photo. The case studies were 2 research farm sites where organic nutrient management activities were being tested for outcomes on soil health and vegetable crop yield over a period of 5 years. This is year 4. The 2 case study sites that I used were UBC Farm here on the Lower Mainland and a farm on Vancouver Island. Beginning in 2023, in those on-field experiments, 8 distinct organic nutrient management treatments were trialed. Each treatment was composed of a nutrient amendment option, that being a combination of compost and fertilizer, and a winter cover crop option, a combination of winter pea, fall rye, and crimson clover in a 3 species, 2 species mix, and a control and fallow plot. Nutrient management treatments were applied to actively productive fields in a 4-year crop rotation, so this experiment did not take them out of production. It was important that the farm continue producing vegetables, and that was a part of the analysis. Farm data that I used to refine my calculator was collected primarily from farm management records, from the insights of farm staff, and from the experimental records. So I was not in the field, I was in the office and on a laptop. Moving on to results. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll focus on results just from the UBC Farm case study. The first step was to assess economic viability for each nutrient treatment and each growing season separately. I used net benefit as the metric for this. Net benefit is measured as the difference between total benefits and total costs for each of the 8 nutrient treatments in one production season. A positive net benefit outcome indicates net profit, while a negative net benefit outcome indicates net loss. The annual net benefit metric enabled visual comparison between the outcomes of multiple treatments in 1 year for a specific crop. What I have on the screen, all 3 of these graphs are for, are for UBC Farm. The graph on the left, that's your left? Yeah. The graph on the left shows the benefit for all, same order on all the graphs I'm going to show you. The blue year left is 2020 big flour. The middle year in orange, the cash crop was beet. And then the year on the right, 2025 in green, the cash crop was bush beans. So looking at these 3 graphs of 3 production seasons, and I think it was 5 different cash crops, you can see that all nutrient treatments produced a positive net benefit in 2023 and 2024. All things included, they were profitable. However, the no compost treatment, so that control and fallow plot, produced a negative net benefit outcome in 2025. That's the one farthest on the end that drops below the break-even axis. Analyses of these results indicated that the higher compost applications were the most beneficial and the no compost the least beneficial most of the time. So the higher compost treatments are always going to be the ones furthest on the left, and then the control and the no compost is going to be furthest on the right. So you can see a sort of trend, the beginnings of a trend early on in the experiment. The lesson from economic viability analyses was that a negative economic outcomes when market yield was positive reinforced the need for economic assessments that captured complexity. No crop had a 0 yield in any year, and a negative yield isn't possible. So to end up with a negative economic result means that there's more going on, that economic assessments need to consider the full farm picture in a way that maybe they currently don't, but these are outcomes that farmers are absorbing and need to know about. For the on-farm research trials, these findings actually prompted them to re-examine any possible on-farm conditions that would have been impacting outcomes in 2025. So already at the first stage, this was useful in being incorporated back into the initial experiment. The second level of analysis that I performed was to compare cumulative net benefit outcomes of the nutrient treatments. I determined cumulative net benefit to be the sum of the annual net benefit values for 2023, 2024, and 2025 in Canadian dollars. These analyses showed outcomes for multiple treatments over multiple years in Canadian dollars. By doing so, I captured trends between longer-term outcomes by incorporating all of the data. With all similarities accounted for, this revealed overall differences that might be attributable to the nutrient management treatments rather than that year's crop or weather. Here, I'm starting to get at a farm-level understanding of the economic picture. These graphs, again, are for UBC Farm. On the left, in the darker blue, you're seeing the cumulative net benefit results. Each column, again, is one nutrient management treatment. On the left, you're seeing a simulated 1 hectare production scale. On the right, you're seeing the same farm data at a simulated 4 hectare production scale. I'll explain the numbers on the top in a moment. So looking at these cumulative results, all nutrient management treatments had positive cumulative net benefit outcomes after 3 years and at both scales. The negative net benefit results in 2025, that green bar that had been below the axis, has been compensated for by positive outcomes in other years. This cumulative analysis shows longer-term patterns and outcomes from farming practices despite annual variability. Now we're getting at what farmers were asking us for. They know that year to year, things can swing wildly between the red and the black. They want to know long-term, what are the outcomes? Because yeah, some years, maybe the yield is bad and some years it's better. What's the trend when we even it out? Now, knowing that some of the costs in the data set Costs and benefits scaled proportionately with production area, such as seed purchasing, and some did not, such as tasks that required equipment setup and takedown. Say your time getting the tractor ready and fueling it up doesn't scale proportionally the same way that your time plowing the field would. I compared the 1 hectare outcomes with the 4 hectare outcomes to examine scaling dynamics within the farm. By comparing the per hectare net benefit results at both scales, so this graph is already in per hectare. On the far one, imagine I took the bars and I cut them all in 4. So that's the net benefit per hectare at both scales. At the larger production scale, the net benefit per hectare improved for all nutrient treatments and at both farms, actually. Those are the figures on top of the bars. That's measured by how much outputs improved. So for the high compost treatments on the left, they improved by 4%. For the no compost treatments further on the right, it was 32 and 17%. So notable increases, definitely worth conversations by our research team. So the key takeaway from this level was that scaling dynamics and economies of scale within farms shape outcomes for farmers and must be considered in decision making. Economies of scale are scenarios when the per unit cost of production decreases as production scale increases. Recent literature had proposed that organic production was scale indifferent or even more efficient, but my simulated results indicated that the non-scaling farm costs for these case studies were producing some unexpected economies of scale. These dynamics, starting with known relationships between costs, benefits, and labor, are incredibly important to consider in assessments. Specifically, doing so requires full and complete data sets. My third and last level of analysis was to evaluate relative economic performance, comparing outcomes of multiple treatments over multiple years against a flexible, customizable metric. I calculated percent difference in performance from a chosen baseline, no longer a Canadian dollar result. By doing this, I eliminated the shared factors to emphasize the differences between nutrient treatment outcomes. There we go. This is my last graph, I promise. This is UBC farm, again, the 1 hectare scale. The bars are in the same order, top to bottom, as they were left to right. So this shows relative performance of nutrient management treatments in net benefit per hectare against the control and fallow baseline. Using the control baseline, isolated and magnified differences by setting the least beneficial outcome of the set as the 0 point. So everything here, we know it's profitable, but by how much and relative to each other. In alignment with previous analyses, high compost outperforms lower or no compost treatments most of the time. That wasn't a surprise. What was interesting is that by comparing a relative performance of different cover crop mixes against a fallow baseline, the simulated results indicated that the 2 species treatments outperformed the 3 species treatments most of the time. So, potential benefits from increased cover crop diversity depend on farm context and may not lead to the expected outcomes. The results suggested that the additional costs of that third cover crop, the winter pea, might have been greater than any additional benefits gained from increased diversity in soil health. These findings prompted re-examination of crop and amendment dynamics such as lag time or species competition on the in-field trials. But for me, this indicated that analysis could give a user a better idea of how much an adaptive farming practice may impact farm economics in future years relative to other options. The really important takeaway from this level of analysis is that it can indicate that A is better than B is better than C. That's the decision-making guidance that farmers need. Moving on to discussion and lessons learned. First, that farm-level economic analyses are context-dependent and they are absolutely not generalizable. The full farm picture has to be captured, including static context, such as farm location, worker wages, and input prices, and the dynamic relationships between farming practices and production scale. Next, that economic output metrics produced by a calculator tool must be customizable, relevant, and only as complex as is necessary for the outcomes of interest. The calculator that I built can calculate profitability of nutrient management practices, as with the first graphs, and compare performance against each other and against customizable metrics in the second and third. Last, that input data accuracy determines output data quality. Farm information that is fed into economic assessment calculators would ideally be real data from farm receipts and records to generate the most conclusive results. Due to some missing data and limitations within the case studies, I had to make substitutions and estimates using the best available reference sources to conduct these simulations. Input data is also a factor in predicting relative future outcomes. Making predictions about future years requires that an activity be past that establishment window and have multiple records. For example, cover cropping is known to take between 3 and 5 years just to establish itself and start impacting outcomes. As for conclusions, British Columbian farmers throughout my journey of doing this research expressed a great deal of interest in user-friendly tools to provide economic information about implementing adaptive farming practices. This calculator framework is applicable to diverse farmer concerns, on-farm adaptation options, and future research directions, such as low or no tillage or integrated pest management. The calculator tool can be integrated into existing farming software to ease the burden of data collection and streamline analyses for farmers, thereby filling a really important capacity gap. Environmental and social costs and benefits could also be incorporated in the future into open-ended categories that I built into the calculator for that purpose, with that in mind. And long-term, quantitative data could be used to inform farmer and policymaker decisions and address farmers' ongoing climate resilience needs. Farmers need robust and efficient information tools in their hands to make the best possible choices for climate resilience in Canadian agriculture. The calculator framework that I built and demonstrated is a meaningful contribution to the state of knowledge on farm economics and, I hope, to climate resilience in our province. A thank you to my committee, to Hannah, to Dr. Sean Smuckler, and Dr. Josephine, who was my external examiner, and to my lab, who gave me a great deal of support throughout this process. And my funders. Yes, Anais.
My question, kind of connecting back to Bernardo's presentation about the non-sale benefit. This seems like a very broad category, and I'm just curious to hear, like, if, like, in the literature you've read or in farmers you've spoken to.
I'm thrilled that you asked. So. I think this is the one for Zoom. Anais asked about clarification on the non-sale benefits. So the one that I was told by the Vancouver Island farmer, for her, it was eating the vegetables off her own farm. That's a non-sale benefit. That one's pretty straightforward. I've learned through this that a lot of farm workers get to take home produce, or farmers eat their own produce. So that's the simplest one. I also added that bit about social and environmental costs at the end because I have a bit of education about ecosystem services assessments. Also, some of Hannah's other work involves the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO's work in SHARP and TAPE, which are these holistic assessment analyses that incorporate social and cultural values. So there are a ton of angles that this can expand to. And so I left that category there as an open-ended, like, space for expansion. In my analyses, it was produce that was eaten by the farmer, but it has a lot of potential to expand and even incorporate, more in the direction of Renato's work of these social and cultural values, as well as environmental assessments. Yeah, Mao. Thank you.
You mentioned that just expand a little bit more on the concept of the really not familiar with in terms of the farm size and how organized here in the farm like is it mostly small farms here, or how do you...
Yeah, thank you. Mao asked about farm size for folks on Zoom. So in British Columbia, the majority of farms are considered small to medium scale, but the 4-hectare production scale of a single crop would be unusual in itself because monocultures are difficult and complicated and risky for a lot of reasons, especially in organic production. So that was mostly to test out these scaling dynamics that we had thought, maybe this will do something. But across British Columbia, most of the farms, especially the organic and the vegetable farms, are small scale. So that's, maybe I don't remember the number at the top of my head, maybe less than 30 hectares. So not mega operations. Yeah. Good question. Okay, Ray has asked about the nutrient treatments that were chosen and if they were for climate resilience. I didn't choose these. This part wasn't me. This part happened before I came on board. But I know that their reasoning for choosing these 8 treatments was because of previous work done by the Sal Lab and Dr. Sean Smuckler regarding cover crop mixes for soil health and regarding compost use for soil health. Specifically, they're trying to find the right balance of cover crop, fertilizer, and compost so that farmers aren't over applying and creating nutrients that leach off into waterways or get wasted. They're trying to be the most efficient possible of how much compost do we need to pay for and apply without over applying and wasting money and nutrients. So this builds on, I think, at least a decade of other work that's been happening at UBC Farm within that lab. That's how they came to these specific species mixes, the winter pea, the crimson clover, the fall rye, the specific kind of compost they were using. The fertilizer was BioFert feather meal. So that's a new thing that was added into this mix. So they've all been chosen because they're trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, the leaching impacts, and just the general waste of nutrient management on these farms. Yeah, they definitely could be. Say they were to become less available, that usually means they become more expensive. That's pretty easy to incorporate in the calculator. I would just change the price. The 2 case study farms that we had, one of them compost was $20 a yard, and one of them, it was $161 a yard. So that depends a lot in British Columbia on the region. We have the mountains, we have the space between us and Vancouver Island, which is ocean. We all know how the ferry crossings can go. So the prices already vary greatly, especially when there are these extreme weather events, especially as climate change gets worse. That definitely will be a factor, and that is something that can be incorporated. Thank you for that question. Oh, I see 3 hands. Oh. Okay, then I guess Naveen.
Wondering about that, whether all farms can expect that.
Sorry, what was that? Oh. Make sure I get both of those. Okay, so for your first question about external funding, for these specific case study farms, there was external funding. UBC Farm is owned by UBC. They don't pay for land, they don't pay for water, they get a lot of free labor from students, from practicum. There's a lot going on there that isn't the average farm. There's also, because we are an educational institution, a lot of external funding that comes into the university. There's donors, there's government grants, there's foundation grants. So there's a lot. That was a lot to incorporate. And we actually eventually at the end chose not to include that in the calculations because it was skewing things so greatly. But initially, when we did this list, I did it with the whole research group, including the farm managers and farm staff. that category had a lot in it. And for the other farm, the Vancouver Island farm, it was a lot simpler. They were still getting research funding from the SAL lab for participating, but they also shared with me that a lot of farmers, and them included, get, I forget the name of the specific funding program, but there's a government funding program that subsidizes farm worker wages, and it depends on the production scale of the farm. There was another program, there were a number of government funding programs that they described that can year to year really impact their financial outlook. And that also initially was included in that external funding category. So even though by the end we had decided as a team that the external funding would be set to zero, throughout the project, it was a really important part of the conversation. And it's also somewhere that could be built out in the future. And then your second question about fixed versus annual costs, that's a good one. I did have to do a lot of work to incorporate that into the calculator. For folks less familiar with agriculture, a lot of the conventional budgeting tools use fixed versus annual costs and then market sale revenues. That's the traditional approach. So I included those in the categories of farm overhead, was a lot of those fixed costs, the rent, the water, the electricity, the cell phone communications, the machinery leases, all of that. And then the annual costs were more in these categories of the field prep, the planting, the field maintenance, and end of season activities. Within the spreadsheets that I made, they are all indicated as, there's 3 different categories actually of like the fixed versus annual is one of them. So I did list each of these 50 plus input variables by those characteristics. But for the most part, they were grouped in that way. In either farm overhead and infrastructure and equipment was fixed, and then the other categories were annual. Okay, thank you.
I think you can all hear me. There is a networking event later with wine, with cheese, in their sandwiches. Give your student society the big smooch for putting that on for you. And it's 5:30 to 8. So we'll share it. If you have any questions, and here tonight, here they were 2 people very much involved with the park to make that happen. And thank you for attending the double header of all of our seminar talks. That's the last seminar this semester. So thank you.
Damn, I don't want to do too much.
I know, so calm.